Our weekend review with Ralph Peake and Chris Robertshaw, who's now my co-host, so I don't need to do much. I can sit back and you're going to pick the subjects this week, and I think the tribunal, as I mentioned there, is one of them.
Three, and we got Rosalind Ranson's tribunal has just come to an end from a public perspective, and then of course there's this growing issue of cost of fuel related to cost of living and how we achieve climate change is the second subject. And finally, I thought before we close, we could have a little bit of a nod and a look at the next week's big issue, which of course is the budget.
On Tuesday.
Yeah, on Tuesday.
Okay.
So.
Well, let's start with this tribunal. I've been down there not all the time by a long chalk. You've been down there for, I think, a bit more than me. Just to give people a background on this, this is the British Medical Association, who are basically taking on DHSC, aren't they? That's the sort of two sides on this.
Well, that's...
No, is that too simplistic?
No, but a more clear definition would be Rosalind Ranson, who, for those who don't know, was the Chief Medical Officer for the Isle of Man, who it is argued was dismissed from Isle of Man service and has stood up against that decision in very, very clear terms, to the extent that she has enjoyed support from the BMA. And as many people will know, who followed it in the newspaper and elsewhere, it has now come to an end from the public perspective. And a tribunal, of course, can be discussed in a slightly different way to the issue of observing on a jury.
Yeah,
case,
if there was a jury, it'd be different, wouldn't there?
There is no jury.
Once it's said in public, it's public, and also they are making the decisions themselves, so they're not going out to this jury.
And there is a whole discussion around the issue of the dismissal, but I don't think it would resonate in a discussion in our circumstance here. But I attended because my interest started a significant amount of time ago when that tragedy occurred at Abbotswood, which was deeply painful for those involved and for those of us watching, hugely uncomfortable. But it's Rosalind's interaction with that process and how the department reacted to it that for me caused the greatest concern that I've had in my whole time in politics. And so it was inevitable, I think, that when the opportunity arose, as a member of the PAC at the time, the Public Accounts Committee, we invited Rosalind to an evidence session, which she gave, and that subsequently was translated into a report to Tynwald, which was laid before in July. So I know the whole story all the way through and followed it, obviously, when it came to the tribunal itself. So putting aside momentarily the issue of the dismissal, and there is a determination on the part of the department in its defence that actually this is nothing to do with greater COVID and the whole issue. It's simply her dismissal or otherwise. I would contend that it's far more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. Because in a nutshell, if the Isle of Man had followed the Chief Medical Officer's advice, I would suggest that there's a significant likelihood that Abbotswood would never have happened in the first place, because Rosalind Ranson was fighting really hard to close the borders on March the 13th of that year. COVID hadn't arrived on the Isle of Man, and she was denied that. She was shut out from that process. Why? Because Catherine Magson, the CEO, and the Director of Public Health, were following blindly the UK direction that we were going to, if you remember this, herd immunity was in play at the time. And Rosalind fought so hard to have a good policy for the Isle of Man that protected the Isle of Man, and she wasn't listened to whatsoever. And ultimately, as COVID got into the Isle of Man, then her advice to close the borders was ultimately reacted to.
But much later.
But in that period of time,
got in, didn't it?
the COVID got into Abbotswood, then the story really gets dark, because after the awful deaths of the individual residents in there, all hell broke loose for Abbotswood. The ceiling fell in. And for example, again, this is public knowledge, but the senior operator of Abbotswood found herself in an impossible position and faced criminal charges for a full year. Tynwald was closed down on it because it's sub judice, we were told. It was inferred it was sub judice when it never was. I'm talking here about the criminal charges against the Abbotswood officers. That person suffered dreadfully in the subsequent year, where she was facing criminal charges. What happened at the end of it? There were no criminal charges. There was nothing.
Is there nothing in front of anywhere now?
No,
because we're always worried about what we can say and what we can't. Because
I can tell you where the situation is up to now. It took a year to arrive at the obvious issue that there were no criminal charges. Subsequently, and it very peculiarly, it came from the police, that when the police said there were no criminal charges, the whole matter had been closed. There was, however, health and safety charges. Yes. That's gone on for a further year. So this person has suffered the stresses and the extraordinary stresses and strains of threatened criminal charges for a year, and now health and safety charges. But I can tell you that the health and safety charges do not relate to the COVID issue. So what we have, in summary...
Hang on, what do you mean? Surely it's got to be connected.
No, it's not.
It's a totally different thing?
Yes. It's as if that, and it's a hell of a thing to say, and it's difficult sad to arrive at the conclusion that actually the DHSC, the government as a whole...
Trying to shut the thing down?
Is trying to find a scapegoat. So...
That's in your view, though, right? Or is that seen but as well? You can't prove it yet, can you? It's allegedly, isn't it? Allegedly.
I believe it to be the case.
Okay.
Now, why on earth was this rush to pounce on the leadership of Abbotswood, only then to conclude there isn't, and then almost out of embarrassment, shuffle around to try to find some health and safety charge to cover their embarrassment? The government's embarrassment over Abbotswood in the first place, only then to find that those charges are not directly related to the COVID issue. So, in summary, if government had acted on Rosalind Ranson's advice, Abbots would not have happened. Secondly, there were no criminal charges. And thirdly, now, the health and safety charges do not relate to COVID. It's been essentially... As citizens, we all want to and believe we must trust our government. This incident, this series of actions, including the fact that here now, back to the tribunal, we have somebody of very high quality who came to the Isle of Man as our chief medical officer, has gone herself through hell and worse, when in fact she was the one who acted more strongly than anybody else to ensure that we did the right things at the right time. It really does put a huge question mark, personally, over my trust in the integrity of government, and that's a nasty thing to have to say.
Have you followed this at all, Ralph?
Yeah, no. Well, obviously, as Chris said, Tynwald wasn't involved in that at all. It certainly kept away from us, so it was only what was in the public domain. It's a breakdown in communication. That's absolutely clear. The department and Abbotswood, the communication completely broke down. So
that's a polite way of putting it. I mean, the way what's been said that we've seen, I mean, and you've seen the headlines that if there's now potential, if something's been backtracked, should we be polite, being added in after the event? All sorts of issues could be raised here.
That's then after the communication's broken down, there's an issue there. Then the covering up bit, that is culture which has no place in today's world, and it's a great, great shame. And I do think, as Chris alluded to, that government should really take responsibility. People just want to know the truth, and if there is something gone wrong, you're better off saying we can learn from this, make the apologies, learn from it and move on. But to have a culture where you're constantly looking to cover up, nobody learns. Nobody learns how to act better. Nobody learns what values they should be following. They're then following the wrong values. They're following values which are to cover up, to protect people at the top. These are all things which government should not be supporting. And so I haven't attended this tribunal at all, but I have attended in person other tribunals, and the culture has been found wanting in the department.
This is jaw-dropping stuff. I mean, that I've seen, and accusations of spying were even used, and all sorts of incredible terminologies you just can't imagine.
Well, the latest one, of course, that came out the other day was that minutes were concocted.
Yeah, well, that's the
a few weeks ago, when actually the meetings took place a long time ago.
And information wasn't coming out as requested by the tribunal. They were forcing it out of them.
It raises the question, to what extent, to how far would government go to protect its reputation and in so doing damage other people's lives and careers? Because frankly, in my humble opinion, that's what's happening and it's got to stop.
So if that is the case, that is the wrong thing to be protecting. You shouldn't be trying to protect that at all. You shouldn't be trying to cover things up. It's much better to be transparent and actually say and learn from it. Take ownership.
A gagging order was probably a settlement that could well be behind the scenes been sorted, but it had a gagging order on it, wouldn't it? And this is what we have to deal with now all the time. Things are quietly just shoved off to one side.
You're absolutely right. On the tribunal, I did attend and heard dreadful things. I never thought people would actually be so, let's say...
choosing your words carefully.
I'm trying to, yeah. Well, basically, why would you put such dreadful language in an email? I couldn't believe people were doing this, as though they felt totally immune to any prosecution, to any... And no.
So this tribunal...
This was recent. This was
yeah,
when I was
but
still in MHK.
it was gagged, was it? So the public had never seen it, or couldn't.
It was in public because I sat in the public gallery, but of course there was no reporters there, so it wasn't reported on. And then there was a deal done at the end, and so there was nothing published. So that's the shock. Yeah. And where are we going to learn? How are we going to improve our society and the way we work if we don't actually learn from our mistakes?
And here's another. There's, as you say, Paul, there's so many questions come out of this issue. But one of the things that hit me very hard when I followed the tribunal was, in Rosalind Ranson, we have somebody of real significance. I mean, she was an advising professor to the CQC in the UK. She's a very, very competent person. We have the audacity to suggest that she, in the tribunal, we hear that she wasn't competent, which is just utter, complete nonsense.
But that side's having to try and discredit people to some degree and do their best to try and win the case, I'm guessing.
But the question that came in my mind was how difficult it is for somebody to protect their interests, how much power, authority, money and legal support government can put behind their side as opposed to the individual standing up for their rights. And we as MHKs, if we had any role at all, it was to support the citizen. And I think that at the moment, although I don't question the integrity of the tribunal at all here, the process of getting that far for an individual who feels that they've been improperly treated by government is a huge mountain.
And many people wouldn't have gone this far. They would have settled it because it's clearly, I mean, the QCs are involved. There's a lot of money involved here now, isn't there?
It's tough. You can imagine being at a tribunal and having to go through all this again. It's a tough place to be. It's not easy.
What is it? 3 days of questioning? I think.
No, 2 weeks. It was.
No, but just Dr. Ranson had 2 days or 3 days.
3 days.
I think it was on. And it was. It was.
Out and out there.
Yeah, because they're trying, that's their job. And let's face it, and once again, make it absolutely clear, we're not taking anything, wait until the answer, the tribunal comes in.
The narrow decision about the tribunal's view of what they've heard, which included at the beginning, incidentally, and this is public knowledge, that Catherine Magson, and here's a question, Catherine Magson announced at the beginning of the tribunal on video link that A, she wasn't going to come to the Isle of Man, and B, she didn't recognise the jurisdiction of the Isle of Man
I didn't
tribunal.
See that one, that's
now,
big.
Hang on a second, stop there for 1 minute. Does that mean that somebody who's employed within Manx Care, for example, is not answerable to the Isle of Man judicial process because the tribunal is part of that. And if that's the case, there's a fundamental problem that we've got to resolve very, very quickly because everybody has to be accountable.
But then she did appear at the tribunal.
Ultimately,
Although it was suggested that she'd come to the Isle of Man, but childcare arrangements couldn't be made. And it was also suggested if she did come back, there might be all sorts of ramifications. But again, I don't know if we should really talk about that. But there could be consequences
I think it's enough to say.
You say it. I'm more risk averse than you.
It's enough to say that the whole idea that somebody working for the greater good of the people of the Isle of Man who lives away is not answerable and accountable in and on the Isle of Man to the people of the Isle of Man. And if that is true, then that has to be resolved very, very quickly as far as Manx Care and DHSC.
She no longer works for the company
the
government?
There are other people.
Yeah.
I mean,
she's just...
Remember, Laurie was asked as the minister in this house, the current house, was he for or against employing senior people in Manx Care, DHSC, who lived off the Isle of Man? And he said, well, we shouldn't rule it out. Well, that's a decision for him as minister. But he surely can only make that decision based on the principle that whoever's employed is accountable, because Catherine Maxson wasn't even employed by the Isle of Man. She was employed by a trust in the UK.
And that took ages to discover because they couldn't find out who, when, and what payroll she was on. I don't know what. Wouldn't it be interesting to have cameras in to watch this?
Somebody who wasn't employed by the Isle of Man, in the sense that we understand it, is responsible for raising the view of somebody who did a remarkable job at the beginning of the COVID crisis, who has had an impeccable record, has this woman, the CEO, has tried to destroy the chief medical officer of the Isle of Man, who did a remarkable job, and has the audacity to bring it to a tribunal. I mean, I think disgust is probably a weak view I have on this.
I think it's jaw-dropping.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, we sat there and you just couldn't believe what you hear. Basically, I mean, and again, it's just like in court. You hear one side of the argument, then you hear the other. But my goodness, this sounds expensive, if nothing else, I think. It's going to be costing... Well, it costs a lot to put on, I'm sure, anyway. But it's going to cost somebody, and no doubt.
And let's not forget where I started on this one, and that is the damage that was done to the people leading and operating Abbotswood, who have been dragged through the courts, through the process, through hell and back, effectively. And for what purpose? Was it really a matter of that there was a guilt there or a problem, or was it that the Isle of Man just simply wanted to cover its embarrassment about the deaths in Abbotswood?
So is there a culture in the Isle of Man government, and that's where we're coming down to here, in civil servants, who will do almost anything not to find the truth out? And I'm being generalised here.
Yeah, you've got to be very general.
And Ralph,
there's some great people in government.
Yeah.
But the culture and structure of government leads towards a situation where control becomes too powerful and too much in favour of the structure and organisation.
Yeah, the structure does lead to that, and this idea, this culture has to change, and that is one thing that I was always trying to do, and I certainly feel the Social Security Department, which I had political responsibility for, we were able to start changing the culture in there, absolutely.
What culture was there then? What was happening?
Well, no, it's about putting the customer first, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Absolutely, so it's about taking it from, expecting people to work, expecting customers to come in at times that suit the staff, to actually turning around and actually making the customer the focus, and actually then offer those services around the customer's needs and times. So that's the sort of culture I'm talking about. So that's all good news. But yes, on the other side of it, certainly in the upper executive level, that culture does appear, and I've certainly felt it, and I could see one of trying to sort of cover up. So if you make a mistake, unfortunately, rather than taking responsibility for it and learning from it, it's one of, right, look around, right, how are we going to sort this out?
So should there be an end to gagging orders? Especially from the government side, I mean, private sector can do what they want, but should there be an actual no? You cannot have this on.
I don't think that necessarily answers it. I think what answers it from my perspective is effectively we ended up with a CEO in charge of DHSC through a massive crisis, which it was. COVID was a dreadful experience for us all, that was too powerful and too detached. But in broad terms, if you broaden it out, you can trace almost every major thing that goes wrong back to an over-controlling CEO in an organisation with it, which is its own legal entity. And I won't bore you with going off at a tangent on that one, but that's in essence what it's about. If you separate the operational delivery off from the strategic and central authority, it gives a certain amount of distance between the authority of government and the authority of the individual departments, which are too overpowerful. You deal with that, and you start to get, as it were, Chinese walls between elements of government, which currently don't exist. And in my view, the roof fell in on Abbotswood, the roof fell in on Rosalind Ranson, in both cases for completely the wrong reason.
But can I just one thing there? It's interesting to see you say that. Should we stop gagging orders?
Well, I think you didn't answer me really. I think.
No.
I want to hear.
That's the point I'm making about headlines. What you're trying to drag out is such and such stops gagging orders. That's the headline. Where's the meaning and understanding behind it? It's not about stopping the gagging orders. It's about having a culture where you don't need the gagging orders, so people are actually working together. Now I appreciate that.
The one you just mentioned, wouldn't you think that would be better if it had come out in public, whatever you went to, whatever happened, and it's never really been seen the light of day?
Now, what Ralph is saying is that not only should the citizen be able to trust government to do the right thing and be seen to do the right thing, but that people working in government should also expect to be able to trust their employer. And the argument I've put to you today is that in extremis, government will act in its interest and damage people along the way in order to protect its interest as an organisation. And that, if you believe that statement, is a damning indictment.
Yes.
Yes, and that's where we try and get the government in a much better place, that they don't feel as though they've got to protect everything. Then you have it working together. So I don't know how many times I heard the last Chief Minister talking about working together. It's an easy thing to actually say on the floor of Tynwald. To actually do it is a much harder thing, but it's the right thing to do. And that's where time and effort should be put in of how you can actually work together. So get behind the headlines and actually make it work. So you co-produce things together so the public and private sector can come together and work and actually go forward in the same direction. And the third sector and government can come together and work together. I know, I appreciate
It'll never happen. I mean, will it?
You see, that's so disappointing.
I know,
that
but
is so disappointing for you to sit there and say it'll never happen.
Because that's the sort of life skills I learned, I suppose, along the way.
Well, as we grow up in life, we should really change our beliefs.
Grow up.
As we grow as a person, you can change your beliefs. And that's the part about the nonsense, I think, that some people sort of see this, the government with and Tynwald with. It's not actually nonsense. It's really important and serious stuff. And it's things that actually can really put the Isle of Man in a great position, not only on the world stage, but in the UK stage.
And in terms of elected representatives, and people know my views on this one, is that people going into departments are too quickly trained to be almost owners of the operational delivery. And by the time you get to a ministry, you're used to defending your department and the government, but the political role, fundamentally, is not only supposed to be at a strategic level, but it's supposed to represent the people, rather than be the protector of the governmental system, which we've discussed this today has serious flaws.
You're the eyes and ears of the public. That's how. So when you're inside making decisions, you're the public's representative, and you should make those decisions for the best for the public.
Okay, done. All right. Feel good? Anything else? Please feel
fantastic.
Open-ended. Fine. Thank you. Join us for our next moment or two on this. What we're going to talk about? We'll talk about gas and climate change. In our next section.